They sent the Barren daughter to the rancher as a joke, but she returned with the child that proved them all wrong. In the rugged plains of Montana Territory, 1885, Clara Wynn was cast out by her own blood. Her parents, ashamed that 2 years of marriage had yielded no child, sent her away to a widowed rancher to work off the family's debt. Her husband had already remarried. Her mother called her useless, and the neighbors whispered that a woman who could not give life didn't deserve to live under God's blessing. When the wagon doors closed, Clara thought her story had ended, but fate was not finished. At the Carver ranch, the man she was given to, Elias Carver, a quiet, scarred rancher, spoke little, asked for nothing, and offered even less. Yet behind his silence lay a gentleness that neither of them could name. Day by day, the two broken souls found something wordless but real, between them acts of small grace that stitched together the wounds of their pasts. But when Clara's old family returned to humiliate her once more, the truth she carried inside would silence every cruel tongue that had damned her. For under the harsh western sun, the woman they called Barren would stand with life stirring within her, proof that mercy grows where pride once withered. And before the wide Montana sky, she would finally discover that love, once scorned and exiled, can rise again stronger than any curse. The Montana Territory, 1885, a land where the wind never seemed to rest. The horizon stretched endlessly, painted in rust and gold beneath the fading Sunday. The Carver ranch sat at the edge of that wild country, miles from the nearest church bell, surrounded by fences that leaned like tired sentinels against the prairie wind. Dust whispered through the sagebrush. The smell of rain and old wood lingered in the air, heavy with the memory of storms that had passed too soon. When Clara Wynn arrived, her heart carried the weight of exile. The wagon left her by the gate, a small figure swallowed by the vastness around her. Her hands trembled as she stepped down, clutching the single satchel that held all she owned: one faded dress, a silver hair comb, and a Bible worn soft at the edges. The ranch house loomed ahead, weathered but sturdy, its windows glowing faintly with firelight. Elias Carver, the man who was now her husband by arrangement, opened the door without a word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face half-shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He looked at her not with scorn, but with distance, the kind that comes from losing too much to hope again. That night, Clara lay awake in a room that smelled of pine and dust. Outside, the coyotes howled across the plain. Inside, she whispered a prayer into the darkness, not for love, not yet, only for the strength to keep breathing where no one believed she still could. The first morning at the Carver ranch began before dawn. The sky was bruised purple, and frost clung to the windows like lace. Clara Wynn rose quietly, afraid of breaking the silence that hung in the house. She dressed in the plainest gown she had, tied her hair back, and stepped into a world that was not hers yet. Outside, Elias Carver was already at work driving fence posts into frozen ground, the sound of his hammer echoing across the fields. He didn't greet her. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. "You are here to work, not to speak." Clara scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She washed the dishes, cooked a meal he barely touched, then watched him walk out again without a word. The walls of the house were thick, but the loneliness inside them was thicker still. That evening, she found something on the kitchen table, a pair of soft leather gloves, new and perfectly sized for her hands. No note, no explanation. She looked toward the barn where Elias's lantern flickered faintly. She didn't thank him aloud. But when she slipped them on, her heart stirred the smallest, most dangerous kind of hope. The next day, the whispers began. When she went into town for flour, the women near the store stopped talking as she passed. One murmured, "That's the Barren one." Another laughed softly. Poor man, taking in someone else's shame. Clara's throat burned. She walked faster, pretending not to hear. But inside, something old and fragile began to crack, the same wound her family had carved years ago, now reopened under a new sky. Dawn in Montana had a way of arriving like a held breath, released pale light sliding over the grass and the roofs and the far blue shoulders of the mountains. On mornings like this, Clara moved through the Carver house, as if each floorboard held a memory she might step on and break. She lit the stove, ground coffee with slow, even turns, and let the kettle sing before the sun did. Her hands were quick, Her mind kept pace with the list she pinned to the inside of her skull. Bread, soap, firewood, stitching. She would not be a burden. She would not be the silence others placed on her. If they would measure her worth by what she could carry, then she would carry the day. Elias returned from the pasture with frost whitening the seam of his coat and the brim of his hat. He left his boots at the door, washed at the basin, and nodded once at the cup she slid across the table, hot, black, strong enough to bite the tongue. He didn't remark on the way she'd started adding chicory. He only drank it as if he'd never had it another way. By the time the sun cleared the wind-bent cottonwoods, chores were scattered across the yard like chess pieces. There was fencing to mend, a creek trough half choked with silt, a mare that had foaled early and needed watching, and a section of roof that had decided last winter to part ways with the house. The ranch was a big animal, and it liked to test the hands that fed it. Elias saddled up with a rhythm learned through repetition and loss. Leather creaked, buckles clicked, his breath steadied. "North fence is near giving," he said finally, his voice low, angled away, like words he wasn't used to lending. "I'll take Luke and Caleb. You can keep to the house. I can run to town after scrubbing," she said, eyes on the table so he wouldn't think she was asking. "We're short on flour and—" She glanced at his raw knuckles from yesterday, split shallow across the first 2 fingers. "Liniment," she added. His gaze flicked to the cuts. For a moment he looked like he might tell her no. He liked to carry his own pain. He trusted it more than people. "Take the bay," he said instead. "She's sure-footed. Don't let the talk bother you." "As if it doesn't bother you," she said before she could stop herself. A muscle in his cheek twitched. The air between them tightened, then loosened as if some invisible rope had gone slack. "It bothers me enough," he said, "but not more than you do. Not more than you do." The words hung warm in her chest long after he rode toward the north fence with the ranch hands trailing like commas in his wake. The house emptied itself into her hands. She scrubbed the hearth until her knuckles blazed, boiled lye, and rendered fat for soap, beat dust from rugs that carried last season's mud in their loops. Outside, the winter-beat sun rose and cooled, and rose again on a gust of wind that smelled like snow and something greener, like spring promising from the edges. When the light had softened and the bread had taken on a crust, she tied a scarf under her chin, fetched the bay from the paddock, and swung into the saddle with the easy caution of someone who'd taught herself to move without making a sound. Town was 9 miles of sky and talk. The road cut between swells of prairie, the color of old wheat, past a stand of poplars that clicked like coins, through a low dip where the wind lived even on still days. The general store sat at the road's end, with a chewed-up hitching rail and a peeling sign. Ladies in neat bonnets who had never bled in a back room while someone counted the calendar days, who had never watched a husband's kindness shrink beneath the weight of his family's names, gathered by the barrels of beans and lamp oil, and their voices formed a fence you could feel, even if you didn't touch it. "That her?" The one sent back. "I heard she sleeps in a different room. Poor rancher. Shame clings." Clara kept her eyes on the flour sacks, stacked like quiet graves. Her hands weighed a 5-pound bag, then another, and when Mr. Hanley, the storekeep, whose wife practiced her whispering like a hymn, reached over to tally the total, he looked anywhere but at her face. "Liniment," she said. "The good kind. The one the drovers swear by." He cleared his throat and fetched a small brown bottle, eyes snagging on her left hand where a plain band lived, simple and unarguable. He set the bottle down, added thread, matches, a tin of baking powder she hadn't asked for, and a tight smile that didn't travel as far as apology. It happened then in a moment that split the day open. The shout was thin and high, a woman's voice running too fast for its own feet. Jimmy, no!" A scrap of a boy, more dust than child, broke free from his mother's hand and bolted, after a kite made of newspaper and hope. He skittered across the packed road, his boots failing the way children's boots do when the ground turns treacherous. From the hill above town thundered a freight wagon, horses wild-eyed, the driver hauling at the reins like a man arguing with God. The world narrowed in the space between a wheel and a small body. Clara didn't think, which is to say something deeper than thought took her. She dropped the flour, sprinted, and when the boy's toe caught the lip of the ditch, She threw herself sideways and gathered him against her chest as if she had spent a lifetime practicing. They slid. The wagon roared past with inches to spare, and clods of cold earth burst against her cheek. The boy's sobs came hot into her throat. She was shaking, but she was whole. And so was he. "It's all right," she whispered into his hair, the smell of soap and wood smoke and fear. "You're safe, you're safe. Mama's got you." The last words escaped her before she knew they lived inside her. "Mama." The sound cracked something open that had hardened into habit. The mother reached them in tattered breaths, hands all over her boy. "Oh Lord, ma'am, oh thank you." She stopped, startled by the look on Clara's face, by the grief that didn't belong to the moment, but threaded through it anyway, a history refusing to sit down. Clara handed the boy over, brushed grit from his cheek with a tenderness that felt older than her bones. Then she stood. The street had gone quiet around the noise. Across the way, by the hardware store, Elias stood half-shadowed where he just stepped from the blacksmith's. He'd seen it all. He did not rush. He did not speak. He watched her with a focus that felt like shelter. On the ride home, the sky carried the color of pewter and the weight of something undecided. The bay picked her way along stones that remembered warmer months. Clara kept replaying the boy's small heartbeat against her ribs. She could swear her chest had learned a new rhythm and refused to forget it. Somewhere in front of her, she knew, were years she'd been told didn't exist. That evening, she set the table and ladled stew into Elias's bowl. He washed up, sat, took a breath that sounded more like permission than hunger. He didn't mention town. Neither did she. Some things didn't need to be wrestled to be known. When she walked to her room, she stopped. On the floor by the doorframe sat a small figure carved from scrap pine. It was rough in the way honest things are, knife marks shallow and careful, 2 tiny button eyes sewn with thread, a suggestion of hands cupped as if catching rain. She picked it up, and its weight was nothing, and also everything. She knew without knowing that Elias had carved it. He had carved it the way he did everything, quietly, when no one was looking. That night, the house breathed while she didn't. She pressed the little wooden figure to her sternum and sat on the bed with her back bent like a prayer leaf. Tears came not with sound but with the kind of gravity that persuades a thing toward the earth. She let them fall because there was no one here to weaponize them. When the well inside her slowed, she lay back, the doll, in the hollow of her palm. Her last thought before sleep found her was embarrassingly simple. Thank you. Morning deserved its own courage. She moved through the kitchen with a strange lightness, as if a wire pulled her forward instead of down. She sliced bread and found it too tough, too honest. She set a thick heel on a plate, drizzled honey over it like forgiveness, and laid a note beside Elias's mug, the letters a little crooked from the lack of practice. Even the tough ones get eaten because they're real. He didn't mention the note. By the time she placed the coffee at his elbow, the plate was empty and the paper gone. But when he lifted his face, when his eyes creased at the edges the slightest bit, she saw it a private smile so small you could keep it in your pocket. It stayed with her through the chores, through the wind that gnawed, through the ache in her lower back that returned in brief, forgettable waves. The ache visited again 2 days later while she was hauling wet laundry up from the creek. Spots of light jarred loose in her vision. The world tilted like a ship. The basket slid from her hip and she grabbed for the post, breath leaving in a rush. By the time sound returned, Elias's hand had closed around her elbow. She hadn't heard him approach. "You're white as the wash," he said, steadying her with a pressure that was careful and firm. "Sit." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just stood too fast." He didn't argue. He guided her to the porch step, tugged her shawl tighter, and disappeared into the house, returning with a cup of water like a man presenting a treaty. "You eat today?" "Bread, coffee earlier." He studied her the way a rancher studies a fence, looking not at the boards, but at where the strain hides. "Tomorrow we go to town," he said. "Doc's got that new listening device. Says he can hear things you can't yet." "I don't." The words faltered. Doctor meant questions. Questions meant rooms with cold light and colder faces, months of scalded hope, and the ache of being told to be patient while someone counted on a calendar until mercy ran out. "I don't want the talk starting again," she finished. "The talk already started," he said. "I can't stop it with words. I can stand between it and you when it comes close." He didn't touch her face. He didn't need to. The way he said it was more than any hand. When the wind shifted, Sunday crept up like a cat. From town to ranch, the prairie carried stories in its side pockets. Clara heard them in odd places. The smithy where sparks jumped like insects. The apothecary where the bell above the door rang a little too loud. The churchyard gate where knots of women laced pity into curiosity. She didn't go near those places anymore, unless necessity made a demand. She stuck to work. Work never asked who she had been before breakfast. On Wednesday, a rider pulled up at the gate with gossip like a letter he hadn't wanted to carry but couldn't throw away. He was a hand from a neighboring spread whose fondness for whiskey gave his face a map of rivers. "Heard something ugly said at Doyle's last night," he told Elias, scratching the back of his neck. "About your wife." "I know," Elias said. "You weren't there," the man replied, uneasy. "I know how men talk when they think the night ain't listening," Elias said. His knuckles remembered. So did the small cut along his forearm that had opened when someone's ring caught him. He'd said little, thrown once, then taken his hat and left. Quiet men choose their moments. The rest of us choose around them. Clara wasn't supposed to hear any of it. She heard all of it. She found herself standing at the window, as dusk made a painting of the yard, watching Elias stack feed with his left arm, doing more of the work than it should. Everything in her wanted to open the door and say something that might serve as thanks, but would feel like apology. Instead, she boiled stew and kneaded dough and stitched the lining back into his coat and thought about lines that connected people without being seen. The weather turned mean. March pretended it belonged to both winter and spring and did neither well. A hard, high wind knifed across the open ground and set the windows to their own little music. The north fence failed the way it had promised to. Elias and the boys rode out with wire and curses and returned ragged, the ranch a little less tamed. That night, a calf went missing, and they tracked her in a sleet that bit their lips and made every word feel expendable. They found her at the creek bank, legs splayed, breath thin. Elias slung her across his shoulders and carried her home with the insistence of a man who wouldn't let the world decide for him anymore. Clara met him at the door with blankets and salt, and a stubbornness to match. The hours that followed unfurled like a bad spool. The calf lived, but the night took a bite out of Elias. By morning, his cough had dropped into his chest, thick as wet ash. He brushed off her concern and went to work anyway. By midday, his steps shortened. By dusk, he admitted defeat without calling it that. She coaxed him into a chair, pressed the back of her hand to his brow, hummed a hymn she hadn't let herself sing since her mother's kitchen, and set a kettle to steam. She cracked mustard seed, mixed it with flour, spread the paste between cloths, and laid the warm poultice over his chest while he looked at her with a surprise he tried to hide. "My grandmother's recipe," she said softly. "Your grandmother sounds like a general," he rasped. "She was," Clara said, and a small laugh was startled out of her like a bird flushed from brush. He slept, then honest, heavy sleep. Clara sat beside him until the cough loosened its hold and his breath lengthened. The wind carved at the corners of the house. The lamp threw a gold circle wide enough for both of them. She watched the steady rise of his chest and felt unexpectedly steadied. When she stood to bank the fire, she saw it again. The small wooden figure he had carved, sitting now on the mantel, as if it had always lived there. The sight quickened something under her ribs, not just gratitude, but a kind of fierce wanting she didn't trust yet. Outside, coyotes stitched the hills with their thin music. She snuffed the lamp and left the room as quietly as if leaving meant keeping something whole. The next afternoon, they hitched the wagon. "Town," Elias said, like a man naming a storm. Clara climbed in without arguing. She didn't want the store's hours, the bell, the pity. She wanted answers she was afraid of. The road slid under them. At the dip, water shone like hammered tin. Elias held the reins steady, his profile carved out of caution and habit. In the doctor's office, white walls, wood backs, the smell of boiled metal. Clara stood small and taller than she had expected. Dr. Calder was a man whose eyes had learned not to make people feel examined when he examined them. He asked questions in a voice that made space for answers. He listened with his device, a thing of rubber tubing and polished horn, and pressed gently at a belly that had been a battleground for other women's certainty. While he listened, while the room took one long breath, Clara kept her eyes on the window. The glass showed the street, a sliver of sky, a boy chasing something that looked like a ribbon and might have been a hope he didn't have a name for yet. She felt not dizzy, but unmoored. Elias sat with his hat in his lap and his hands like anchors. "Mrs. Carver," the doctor said, and then paused. Something kind buckled his mouth into almost a smile. "Whatever had to be earned has been." Clara blinked. Her throat closed around air and let it through only on the second try. The office blurred, then resolved, then blurred again. She didn't trust words. She didn't trust the machine of wanting. Elias did not reach for her. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees the way men do when they are about to stand up into joy or into grief and don't know which is waiting at the door. "Doc," he said quietly, and the question he didn't ask hung between them like a lantern. 8, maybe 10 weeks, Dr. Calder answered. Strong. He didn't speak the word miracle. In rooms like this, you learned not to pin weighty names on small beginnings. He only nodded once, as if to confirm something the body had already decided. Clara heard the rest advice about broth and rest, about lifting, about heat when the ache came and cold, when it swelled, and understood none of it the way you understand a river when you've only ever seen a well. The old voices were quick to gather, as if they'd been waiting in the hall, barren, broken, empty, cursed. They lined up like grim relatives who insisted on attendance at every family gathering. Over them, something new tried its throat. Possible. She sat because her knees voted for it. The room became the size of a chair, a hand, a heartbeat. She hated that her first instinct was fear, an old, obedient dog returning when called. What if wanting destroyed the thing you wanted? What if hope was a trick with pretty words? Elias shifted his chair closer, without scraping the floor, one of the many small considerations he performed like breath. He placed his palm over hers, where it lay clenched on her skirt. Warmth, simple as bread. "You don't owe anybody a smile," he said, voice low enough to belong only to them. "Let me hold the believing for a while." Her laugh hiccuped out on a sob. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have to be. She leaned toward him until her forehead found his shoulder. He smelled like cedar and horse, and the kind of smoke that lingers in wool. He did not move to lightness or to flourish. He only made himself the shape she needed, and stayed there. She folded around that, and the room, and the newness, and the old fright, and the way the world goes on anyway. On the way home, news traveled faster than the wagon wheels. It always did. By the time they turned up the Carver lane, 2 neighbors had already found reasons to be passing by. The first tipped his hat with a grin that was not unkind. The second tried to make a blessing into a curiosity. Elias's spine lengthened. He guided the team into the yard and set the brake with a finality that sounded like a line being drawn. He helped her down as he always did, one steady hand, nothing fancy, and if anyone saw tenderness where he meant only care, that was theirs to name, not his. The next morning sunlight rang bright on every edge of the world. The air held the thin sweetness that crawls out of cold ground when the first green thinks about showing itself. Clara moved through the house with the care you give combustible things. She touched the back of a chair, the ridge above the wash basin, the spoon she'd used the day the bread had come out dense as stubbornness. She placed the little wooden figure on the mantel where the light could find it early and often. She expected joy to roar. It didn't. It settled in like a quiet lodger who paid on time and didn't slam doors. It was the absence of a weight she had learned to balance. She kept forgetting she could walk without it, and then remembering with an embarrassed start that she had. Of course, the world refused to let a mercy go by unargued. By Friday, the road threw up a wagon with too bright paint and a crack in the rear wheel that announced more haste than prudence. 2 horses followed with riders whose posture declared that they weren't here to ask. Clara stood on the porch and tightened her hand on the railing because some habits have to be held onto while you let them go. Marlon Greeley, once husband, looked smaller than memory and meaner than rumor. His parents wore their Sunday faces tight as boots, a size too small. Mrs. Greeley's eyes moved over the yard, as if it were a room that had forgotten to be a shame. "So this is where you've run to," she said, half hiss, half him. "Spreading lies." Lish. Elias emerged from the barn, with the purposeful calm of a man who never learned to hurry and didn't see a reason to start. He wiped his hands on a rag, set it on a fence post, and walked toward the porch without increasing his stride. Luke and Caleb stopped what they were doing and pretended not to be listening. The wind paused too, as if the land itself wanted to hear. "What business?" Elias asked, which is another way of asking for a sane reason to waste a day. "That woman, mister," Greeley said, thrusting a finger at Clara without looking up to meet her. "She's claiming—" "I'm not claiming," Clara said, and her voice surprised her by arriving steady. "I'm carrying." Mrs. Greeley made a small bark of disbelief. "Impossible. That girl is—" "Be careful with the names you give women," Elias said, not unkindly and not soft. "They have a way of coming back for the men who use them." He reached into his coat, unfolded a paper whose crease lines wanted to be permanent, and held it where anyone standing on honest ground could see. "Doctor's word," he said simply. Marlin's mouth worked and made no words. His eyes kept aiming at the earth. Mr. Greeley's jaw clicked like a cheap clock. "Mrs." Greeley tried to find a place to put her anger that looked like righteousness, and couldn't. "Tricks," she said finally. "You've always been a sly little—" Elias took one step, not a stomp, not an advance. A step that said he could make space where space refused to be made. The air felt different after. "That's enough." The yard had gathered witnesses without permission. A trio of women from a neighboring homestead, a passing drover, even the post-rider whose horse had learned to stop for arguments. Eyes turned, the way eyes do when they hope to see a man be better than his habit. The wind wasn't moving. The sky had decided it would be vast somewhere else for a minute. Maybe the man was the one who couldn't, Elias said, and didn't lace it with shame, which made it land heavier. A small noise ran through the gathered surprise, recognition, the shaky sound of a long-held story loosening. Mrs. Greeley's face did something ugly, then broke into a sheet of clean nothing. Mr. Greeley hauled the brake on the wagon like he had just remembered how to be somewhere else. Marlin finally raised his head and looked at Clara. The boy in him, frightened, proud, taught to believe his body's failure lived in the women around him, stared for a heartbeat, and then retreated behind posture. They turned the team and rattled away with more dust than dignity. It hung in the yard after they were gone, a small, failing cloud. No one cheered. This wasn't a fairground victory. It was a bone set back into a joint. Elias didn't look at the neighbors. He looked at Clara. For the first time since the porch had learned her weight, her shoulders unhitched. The railing didn't need her grip. Days followed that felt like the opposite of winter, even when the wind refused to agree. Women who had pretended not to see her in town began to tilt their faces toward hers and let their smiles be sincere. Mrs. Hanley sent a length of soft muslin with her flower. A young wife, whose eyes had been taught to widen with gossip, brought a jar of preserves and a mouth that floundered its way toward apology. The apothecary offered peppermint leaves for the nausea that came and went like an absent-minded visitor. The world could be kind and late. She decided to accept both. At night, when the house settled into the sigh it made after work, when the lamp pulled a gold lake onto the table and the coyotes moved their small songs farther from the yard, Clara and Elias developed the sort of conversation that lives between words. She folded his shirts, he sharpened his knives, and something warm and ordinary drew a chair for itself and sat with them. He asked how many siblings she had. She said one brother who measured love in tasks and never learned restraint. She asked him what he'd wanted before the world suggested otherwise. He said he'd wanted land that held a house that held a laugh. Later, in bed, the one that was still only hers, she rested her palm low over her belly and wondered what it meant that hope made her tired. The day before the first real thaw, a storm rose mean and sudden. It rode down off the hills with a mouth full of ice and a mood. A heifer in the lower pasture decided she didn't like fences and broke for the creek line. Elias cursed into the collar, saddled fast, and aimed toward the brown streak of moving trouble. Clara stood on the porch in the white roar and tasted the edge of worry on her tongue. The wind bit through her coat. She pulled it tighter and stayed, because staying was braver than pacing. It was near dark when she saw them, Elias, the heifer, and the storm, all arguing with each other at once. He slid from the saddle to free the animal's hind leg from a tangle of wire, with hands that had learned careful long before they learned strong. The heifer lurched and the wire snapped, and the world made that high, terrible sound of something giving way where it shouldn't. Elias grunted, went to one knee, and then stood as if standing were the only trick he knew. He brought the heifer in with a limp he tried to iron flat by sheer will. When he finally climbed the porch steps, the left side of his trousers shone wet at the thigh where the wire had kissed him wrong. She took one look and went all general like her grandmother. Chair, now. He sat before the word finished leaving her mouth. She fetched boiled water and carbolic and stitched him with hands steadier than the day deserved. He didn't flinch, not out of pride, but out of a belief that moving would make her task harder. When she finished, he said only, "You sew straighter on skin than on cloth." "I'm not in the habit of hemming men," she said. His mouth tilted at a corner. "First time for everything." He sobered. "Thank you. It wasn't just for the stitches." And they both knew it. The storm burned itself out by morning. The air the next day had that washed look, distances newly revealed. Clara put on her boots and walked the fence line with Elias, because she liked the way the day opened when they walked side by side. He carried the post maul and wire and a length of plain diligence. She carried a pail of staples, and the belief that some mornings are an answer without a question. At the far edge of the north pasture, where the land sloped in a way that made sky look nearer, she felt the first true curl of nausea. She pressed her palm to her belly, closed her eyes until the horizon steadied, and then breathed through the passing. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like more than a report. By supper, a deep contentment had found a chair again. She set down 2 bowls. He broke bread along its honest seam and handed her the larger piece. The lamp swung just enough to make the shadows look like company. The wooden figure on the mantel watched the room with its painted smile and its cupped hands. Wind worried at the eaves, but without malice. They ate quiet, the way people do who earned their hunger. When the bowls were empty and the day was down to cinders, Elias cleared his throat, then abandoned the attempt at a speech, like a man wise enough to see where words would only get in their own way. He rose from his chair, walked around the table, and stopped beside her, as if he'd discovered a new country and wasn't sure what shape it wanted to be. "If there's ever a day you can't stand, it can lean on me," he said. "Doesn't have to be braver than that." Clara felt something unbraid inside her. Not the old rope of stubborn survival, she would keep that, but the tight twist of being alone in a room full of air. She tilted her face up. He didn't kiss her. He didn't have to. The look that passed between them felt more intimate than anything skin could hurry. Outside, the night went on. Inside, the house learned a new sound. 2 people breathing in time. Spring came quietly to the Montana plains, the way forgiveness often does, without announcement, without trumpets. Only the faint scent of wet soil and the first blades of green pushing through the cold. For Clara Wynn, the days had started to taste different. The bread rose higher. The air inside the house carried warmth that didn't come from the fire alone. And though her body felt heavier with each passing morning, it was not the weight of labor or sorrow, it was something she had never dared to name before. She would wake to the sound of Elias Carver chopping wood outside, the steady rhythm echoing through the still air. Sometimes, when she paused in her work, she would see him glance toward the window, just once before returning to the swing of his axe. It was not romance, the way the world told stories about it. It was quieter, but in that quiet lived something stronger than promise. Trust. Still, Clara had learned too many times that peace was a fragile thing. One afternoon, she found herself on her knees in the garden, pulling weeds from between new shoots of corn. The sun was kind, the breeze forgiving, but when she stood, the horizon betrayed her 3 dust clouds rising fast from the road, each kicked up by riders coming hard. Her stomach tightened. Even before she saw their faces, she knew. The past had come to collect its due. The lead rider was Marlon Greeley, her former husband. He had the same arrogant tilt to his chin, though his eyes were duller, his once proud coat now frayed at the cuffs. Behind him rode his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Greeley, dressed in stiff Sunday black as if coming to a funeral, and perhaps, in their minds, they were. Elias came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. "Mrs. Carver," Mrs. Greeley's voice cracked through the yard like a whip. "You've been telling lies in town. Shameful ones." Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. Her heart beat steady, though her knees trembled. "I've told no lies," she said evenly. "Oh, haven't you?" the woman sneered. "Word is you're expecting a child. That's impossible. You're barren, girl, always were. The doctor said so." "That doctor's dead," Elias said quietly. "And the living one says different." "Mr." Greeley puffed his chest. "You've tricked this man, Clara. You always were sly. You'd do anything for attention." Elias folded the rag in his hands and set it on the fence post, each movement deliberate. Then he took a step forward, just one, and held up a folded slip of paper. "This," he said, "is a certificate from Dr. Calder. It says my wife is with child. Nearly 3 months." The word wife rolled across the yard like thunder. Gasps came from the ranch hands who'd gathered near the barn, from neighbors who had wandered closer to watch. Mrs. Greeley's lips parted, her face whitening beneath the brim of her hat. "That's a trick. A lie." "No," Elias said. "It's the truth. The kind that doesn't need your permission." He turned slightly, his voice calm but carrying across the yard. "You called her broken. You sent her away. But maybe it wasn't her body that failed. Maybe it was the heart of the man standing beside you." All eyes fell on Marlin. He flinched as though struck. His mother hissed his name, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any confession. A murmur swept through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "Maybe it was never her." Another, bolder voice added, "Maybe the wrong one got sent away." Color drained from Marlin's face. He turned his horse sharply, muttering something lost to the wind. His parents followed, the wagon lurching after them, kicking up dust that hung like shame between earth and sky. When they were gone, silence fell heavy. The crowd shifted uncertainly until Elias spoke again, this time only to Clara. "You don't have to explain anything to them. You never did." Her throat closed around 100 replies, but only one escaped. "I know." That night, the ranch was alive with the murmur of rain against the roof, steady and forgiving. Clara stood by the window, watching drops run down the glass like tears she no longer owed to anyone. Elias came up beside her, his presence warm but unspoken. "They'll talk for a while," he said, "but talk dies quicker than truth." Clara turned to him. "You didn't have to defend me." "I know." He hesitated. "But I wanted to." She looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, still faintly raw where the wire had bitten him days before. She reached for them, this time without fear. His fingers closed around hers, firm, grounding. And for the first time since the day she'd been cast out, Clara felt whole. The weeks that followed changed everything. The town that once whispered behind her back now greeted her by name. The women who used to sneer offered congratulations. Mrs. Hanley from the store sent a jar of peach preserves with a note that simply read, "Forgive me." Even the pastor's wife, who had called her a lesson in pride, came one morning to help mend clothes for the baby. But the biggest change came not from others, it came from within. Clara no longer hid her growing belly beneath thick shawls. She wore light-colored dresses now, soft blue and cream, the fabric stretching gently over new life. She worked slower, rested often, and smiled more than she realized. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the wash basin, she hardly recognized the woman looking back, a woman, not merely surviving, but living. Elias changed too. His words came easier. His laugh arrived more often, and he began fixing the old corral near the meadow, saying, "We'll need more space soon." He didn't say it, but she knew he wasn't only speaking of the horses. One evening, as twilight settled over the ranch, the lanterns flickered to life around the yard. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. The neighbors had gathered for what Elias called a harvest supper. Tables stretched beneath the open sky, covered in simple linens, bowls of potatoes, and warm apple pies. Clara moved among them, her hands resting unconsciously over her rounded belly. She could feel the baby's faint kicks, now soft, like secrets shared between mother and child. Every so often, someone would stop her just to say, You look happy." And for once, she believed it. When the last dish was cleared, Elias stood. The crowd quieted. He raised his glass, his voice carrying with that low, unhurried steadiness everyone had come to know. "Folks around here like to say I married out of necessity," he began, "that I took a wife to settle debts or fill an empty house. But truth is, I got the better end of the deal." Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft and kind. "I got someone braver than me," he continued. "Kinder, too. She walked through hell and came out holding heaven in her hands. There." He looked at Clara then not as the rancher who had once stood in his own silence, but as a man who had learned the shape of grace. "So tonight," he said, "I don't make a speech, I just make a promise." He knelt, not fully, but enough that the gesture spoke louder than any ring. "If you'll have me for all my days," he said, "I'll spend them trying to deserve you." A hush fell over the gathering. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled, blurring the world into color and light. She nodded once. Then again, her voice barely a whisper. "You already do." The people cheered softly, not wild, but warm, because even the toughest hearts in Montana knew when something holy had taken root. Elias rose, his hand still holding hers. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The way they looked at each other was promise enough. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the stars had gathered like blessings overhead, Clara stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, scented with rain and wheat. Behind her, Elias came up quietly, draping his coat over her shoulders. "You're shivering," he said. She smiled. "I'm fine. I just wanted to remember this the night the world finally felt right." He looked out at the land, endless, open, and alive. "It's not the land," he said softly. "It's you, Vet." She leaned against him, his arm sliding around her as the wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote howled, but even that sounded like part of the harmony. In that moment, under the wide Montana sky, Clara knew the truth. They had not found redemption by escaping the past, but by facing it together. The woman once sent away in disgrace now stood on her own ground, carrying life where others had sworn there could be none. And the man who had lived years behind silence had found his voice in her. The months that followed moved like honey, slow, golden, and heavy with meaning. The days grew longer, the wind warmer, and the ranch itself seemed to breathe easier. Fields once brown and brittle now shimmered green under the spring light. The horses kicked their heels in the paddock, calves stumbled on new legs, and laughter, real laughter, found its way into the Carver house for the first time in years. Clara Wynn woke each morning to the gentle thump of Elias moving about the kitchen, his voice low as he hummed an old hymn that had long forgotten its words. He'd leave a plate of cornbread near the stove, still warm, and a single wildflower in a chipped mug beside it. When she teased him about it, he'd shrug and say, "The land's been generous this year. I'm just paying rent." As the baby grew, Clara slowed her pace, though her spirit seemed to grow stronger, even as her body tired. She would sit by the porch each evening, one hand resting on her belly, and talk softly to the child, as if the wind itself were listening. Sometimes Elias would sit beside her, silent as always, but every now and then his hand would cover hers, and in that silence their hearts spoke louder than words. Then came the night when the first true pain struck, sudden, sharp, and deep enough to steal her breath. The sky outside was swollen with thunderclouds, and rain lashed against the windows like desperate fists. Elias was at her side before she could call his name. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply wrapped his arms around her trembling frame and whispered, "It's time, Clara. It's time." The hours that followed stretched into eternity. The doctor arrived breathless, his horse slick with rain. Lightning carved the sky in white ribbons as the wind howled through the rafters. But inside that small room, time bent. Every cry, every prayer, every heartbeat became part of the same rhythm, the ancient, trembling song of life, finding its way into the world. When at last the storm broke and dawn bled through the curtains, the ranch was quiet again. Clara lay still, pale but radiant, a sheen of sweat on her brow and a tiny wailing miracle in her arms. The child was small fists curled like secrets, hair dark as Elias's, voice strong enough to wake heaven. Tears blurred her sight as she looked down. "Is he?" she whispered. Elias knelt beside the bed, one hand trembling as he brushed the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," he said, voice breaking on the word. Clara smiled weakly, eyes glistening. "They said I never could." Elias leaned close, pressing his forehead to hers. Then they were wrong about everything. Outside, the ranch came alive with light. The storm had washed the dust from the world, leaving behind air so clean it hurt to breathe. The men in the yard took off their hats, silent in awe, while the women who'd once doubted Clara now brought bread, broth, and blessings. No one spoke the word Barren again. By noon, word had spread across miles of prairie. The woman they'd once called cursed had brought new life into the world. And as the sun broke fully over the hills, Elias carried the baby to the porch and held him high against the morning light. "This," he said quietly, "is what mercy looks like." That, behind him, Clara watched from the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes shining like the dawn itself. For the first time, she didn't hide. She didn't shrink beneath old shame. She stood proud, steady, unbroken. The wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming sage. It moved through the grass like a whisper of angels, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop just to listen. Later, when the ranch quieted again, and the baby slept between them, Clara turned to Elias. "Do you think people can start over?" she asked softly. He looked at her, the woman who had been thrown away and still found a way to bloom. "No," he said, "not start over. Just start right this time." She smiled, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, the baby's soft breathing between them. "Then we'll start right," she whispered. And so they did. From that day forward, the Carver Ranch was known not as a place of debt or shame, but as a place where life had begun again, where silence had learned to speak, and brokenness had learned to love. Sometimes at sunset, Clara would ride out to the edge of the pasture, the baby wrapped in a shawl against her chest. She'd look across the land that had once felt so lonely and whisper, "We're home." Well, Elias would always be near, riding just ahead, turning his head slightly when she called his name, his hand reaching back until her fingers found his. And beneath the endless Montana sky, their silhouettes, man, woman, and child, moved together as one. The Montana plains slept in gold that evening, bathed in a light so soft it could have been mercy itself. The fields shimmered, the air hummed with quiet, and a sense of peace settled over the Carver Ranch like a long-delayed blessing finally come home. Clara Wynn sat on the porch, rocking gently, the baby cradled in her arms. The boy's tiny hand curled around her finger with a strength that made her heart ache. Every breath he took felt like proof that miracles didn't arrive with thunder, they came on the quiet wings of faith that refused to die. Inside the house, Elias Carver moved about with the same steadiness as always, mending a harness, setting wood by the stove, humming under his breath. But his eyes softened every time they met hers, and the space between them, the silence that once felt like a wall, had become a home of its own. The people of the valley still talked about them, but the tone had changed. Where once they whispered pity, they now spoke reverence. The barren woman who bore a son, the quiet rancher who defended her against the world. One afternoon, Pastor Dorr rode out to bless the child. As he prayed, the baby cooed and kicked, reaching toward the sunlight streaming through the window. When the pastor finished, he smiled and said, "Sometimes the good Lord hides his miracles in plain sight. You two just had the patience to wait long enough to see it." That night, long after the lamps were out, Clara slipped from bed and stood by the window. The moon painted the fields silver. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who'd left her parents' house in shame, convinced her life was over. That girl had died on the road to the Carver Ranch, and from her quiet grave, this woman had been born. She looked down at her son sleeping soundly in the cradle Elias had carved by hand. "You'll never be told you're not enough," she whispered. "Not while I breathe." Elias stirred, half awake. "Talking to him?" "To all of them," she murmured. "The ghosts, the ones who said I couldn't." He rose, came up behind her, and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. "They can't hear you anymore," he said softly. "I know," she answered, leaning back into him. "But I want them to know they were wrong." Red. Outside, a lone coyote called into the night, a single, haunting note that faded into the hills. Elias pressed his lips to her temple. Let them talk, he whispered. The wind will take it, same as everything else. Clara smiled, her eyes on the horizon where dawn would soon break again. Then let the wind remember, she said. It carried me here. Zai. And as the stars turned above the sleeping land, the woman once called Barren held her child close and breathed in the sweet, living proof that love, quiet, steadfast, and unyielding, had the final word.